Hi, welcome to my presentation on the 1619 project. Um, I'm going to go through this a little more quickly than I planned to because I've run out of my 15 minutes every time I've tried to record this. So I'm going to talk to you about the 1619 project and then get us to a discussion board. This is a project curated by Nicole Hannah Jones. Some say authored by, some say created by. She is credited as the author in a lot of the work, but it's a massive undertaking by many contributors, so she has considered herself the curator of the project. The 1619 project is a commemoration of the 400th anniversary of Africans arriving in America. And if you look at the sign here that commemorates the spot in which it happened, it begins very calmly, very benignly. This is the place Africans arrived, how many of them there were. But when you start reading into it a little bit more, you understand that they were captives who were brought here and then purchased and enslaved um, 400 years ago in 2019. Uh, so in August 1619, the first Africans were brought here to Point Comfort, Virginia, now Fort Monroe, Virginia, which has been declared a national monument. They were brought here on a ship called the White Lion. The White Lion attacked a Spanish ship called the San Juan Bautista and took, according to the history books, took all of its cargo, which included African prisoners. Um, Hundreds of African prisoners were killed in this battle. 20 survived. They were brought to America on the White Lion, and the captain of the ship sold them for food and supplies. Thus, slavery was born in America. And the reason we can make this statement as fact, as historical fact, is because there are primary sources that show that Governor George Yardley and Cape Merchant Abraham Piercy purchased these 20 people for with food and supplies and then put them directly to work on their land, forced work. There's an article here you can look up. It's online. It's an online article, Point Comfort, that has a lot more of the details you may find interesting. Now, commemorating this 400-year anniversary is the 1619 project published by the New York Times Magazine. It was published on August 14th, 2019. It contained 10 essays and a photo portfolio. And also part of the project included a 5-episode podcast and multiple digital and social media representations. And the whole point of calling it a project, according to the editor, Jake Silverstein, is that it's an ongoing body of work that will continue to grow and change, that has been criticized by some as though they're backtracking or changing what they're saying, but like many historical documents and living history documents, they do change as more information becomes available. Since the beginning of the project, in which it was the New York Times Magazine article, the blog, and the podcast and the education materials that were all part of the original project, there's also been a book published by Nicole Hannah Jones called The 1619 Project: A New Origin Story, and a book that introduced me to the project, Born on the Water, which is a beautiful children's book co-authored with Renee Watson and illustrated by Nicholas Smith. Beautiful, beautiful origin story for children, especially African American children who are seeking their ancestry story beyond what we can find in typical American history books. There's also a 6-episode Hulu series that took 6 of the essays from the original project and presents them in a mini series. This has also been widely criticized because a lot of it is discussion, conversation, and it's not just a traditional history documentary. So critics are picking it apart as not real history because it's presented in a more conversational storytelling and narrative way by a lot of Black people. So the critics are particularly irritated with that. Nicole Hannah Jones, beautiful, bright, dynamic, highly educated woman who isn't afraid to speak her mind, took on this project for many personal reasons that she shares on her website. A lot of them related to her father, who was a veteran and proudly flew the American flag in front of their house and claimed the identity of American citizen for himself and his family. That means a lot to her. I would encourage you to go look at her website and see a lot of her work and the many awards and accolades that she's received. I have a couple of clips too, so you can see Miss Hannah Jones in action. The first one is a 30-second clip at 1840. Let me get to that. As you can imagine, that statement of our country being born on an idea and a lie really ruffled the feathers of people who love this heroic American, um, the foundation of America, the heroism of our founding fathers, and this story that's been told that she calls that a lie, and then goes on to say a lot more. Here's another clip I want to share with you.
To this country's narrative. I would like to offer tonight as a source of
So again, here we hear Nicole Hannah Jones being very outspoken and very dynamic about America not really being that special, not being that different from many of the other slaveholding countries of the time, and that what she is really asking is not that we continue to idealize the founding of America, but to really just look at it for the truth of the times, and for our history to be an accurate representation of what was happening, and calling into this hero worship of our founding fathers, questioning that. That's where a lot of people have trouble with her, but they are trying to put it more on what they're calling lies or inaccurate information. So we're going to go into a couple of articles that were written in response to the 1619 project. The first one was authored by Dr. Morell. He's a Black university professor, author, scholar, PhD, writer of history books. He specifically said about the project that while it's critical to the understanding, the study of slavery is critical to the understanding of the economic development and character of American capitalism, the 1619 project is riddled with factual errors, and its theories on capitalism should not be conflated as an accurate historical account. He goes on to say that only complete and accurate histories belong in classroom curricula, and thus the 1619 project must not be taught as history in our schools. Coincidentally, he writes complete and accurate histories that are used in schools. So I think part of that discussion is what is considered complete and accurate, and whose interpretation of those primary documents are worthy of consideration. Another article that I found, he writes for the Heritage Foundation, a very conservative, by their own definition, a conservative think tank that supports traditional American values. Mike Gonzalez, one of the editors, writes often very nasty op-ed pieces about Nicole Hannah Jones, in which he calls her defiant and foul-mouthed, that she often has to be bleeped because of her liberal use of curse words. This reminded me of the Cardi B Beyonce complex article that we read by Ashley Payne. Our discussion board is going to touch on that. Another article is Dr. Fleming Hunter. She's also a Black university professor, scholar, and author, also an activist. She didn't criticize the 1619 project as much as she thought it didn't go far enough in bringing Black children's history into the story, in that children make history, and that in the case of Black children, history is made at great odds compared to almost all other children in America. And when people are talking about reparations, as they do in the 1619 project, that children must be included in the talks. Dr. Fleming Hunter writes for Phylon, the Clark Atlanta University journal founded by W.E.B. Du Bois in 1940. And so very different journals, very different authors, very different journals, very different perspectives on the project. I want to go back though to some more of our course readings. First, we talked about the Cardi B Beyonce complex, but here we have this chapter 4 work by Duncan. It was in the CRT chapter 4 book. On page 74, he writes about how CRT privileges the voices of those who bear the brunt of the inequalities. And I think that the 1619 Project is a representation of that. It's privileging the voices of the people who have been affected by this unequal representation of history, unequal treatment of their ancestors in American history. So, according to CRT, um, theories, these are the voices that we should be listening to. This reminds me then of Paulo Freire, who is cited many, many times in the articles and works we've been reading about critical theories. In his book Pedagogy of the Oppressed, 5th anniversary edition, on page 86, he talks about words and their power and says there is no true word that is not the same at the same time a praxis. Thus, to speak a true word is to transform the world. It's a big tenet of Freire's work that our words change the world. Um, so when we think about words and how they're used throughout the 1619 Project, I think of another Freire quote in which he says, "To exist humanly is to name the world, to change it." Another controversy of the 1619 Project is the vocabulary they use. They call it as they see it. They use the word human trafficking instead of the Atlantic slave trade, the Middle Passage, or journey in which Africans embarked and arrived on journeys. They called it human trafficking. They use human trafficker instead of slaver, slave trader, or slave dealer. Instead of presenting them as businessmen in a trade, they are presenting them as criminals, as human traffickers. Use the term enslaver instead of master, mistress, or slaveholder, again, very deliberately, taking the power away from the terms of master and mistress. They use the term enslaved person instead of slave, chattel, or property, and say freedom seeker instead of fugitive slave. They talk about forced or unpaid labor instead of slave labor, and forced labor camp instead of plantation. You can imagine that's the one a lot of people have a problem with. Plantation is this very idyllic Southern idea, and forced labor camp calls into mind things that certain people would rather not think about. So these are very human-centered terms, very much putting modern truths on what has been sort of softened over time with the words that history chooses to use instead. So this is challenging us to think about the words we use when we teach about slavery in America and the words we use when we teach that. So that takes me to our discussion of reparative semantics. In our discussion boards and in class, we talk a lot about what can we do as teachers, what can we do? And Reinhardt talks about reparative semantics. That's something we can do, that we can think about the words we use and how that presents it. The historical analysis. Freire says there is no true word that is not at the same time a praxis, again from the earlier quote. And what that means with praxis is that there's verbalism, that's what we say, it's words without action. There is activism, which is oftentimes action without words, or reflection, and then praxis. The goal is praxis, where we have reflection and action and radical interaction to transform the world. That's where we come in as educators. We can think about the ways we use terms in our classroom, even if certain things are banned, legislated, outlawed, certain things we're not allowed to teach, books we're not allowed to use. We can, as educators, think about and decide for ourselves the terminology that we use when we talk about things. So I want you to go to the discussion board, the Jamboard discussion. It will be linked in the weekly lesson. To discuss these questions and other topics, there are two specific Jamboards. One is to compare and contrast Nicole Hannah Jones with another woman who speaks on a lot of the same topics, but much more well received. So we'll talk about that. And then, again, about the discussion about reparative semantics. The other slides aren't showing up. I don't know why not, but you can talk about that there. Used a lot of references. Leave that up for just a second. And thank, as ever, Slides Go, who I use a lot for their really great slide template. So thank you for